Hi, welcome to Propaganda Spotlight. My name's Tim. Today we're going to take a look at a video posted recently by Danny Ayalon, who is currently serving as Deputy Foreign Minister in Israel. There's a link there to the video in case it becomes separated from the response. Okay, so what we're going to do is take a look at some of the techniques that Israeli propagandists use to try and mislead and to control public perception about their actions. Israeli propaganda is some of the best propaganda on earth, which is why I find it so fascinating. So let's get stuck into this video. So the propaganda starts pretty early. It starts straight away with the title. It looks pretty innocuous, but the key point here is that it describes it as the Israel-Palestinian conflict, not the Israel-Palestine conflict. This is quite deliberate. What it doesn't want to do is indication that there is a geopolitical entity called Palestine. That is a no-no. It's absolutely important that that doesn't happen, which is why you'll always find it described as usually the Israel-Palestinian conflict, sometimes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, depending on how extreme right-wing the various propagandists are. And it's interesting because it's a little known. I mean, everyone knows about. Everyone who follows the conflict knows about the 1988 Hamas Charter, which is notoriously anti-Semitic, calls for driving Jews into the sea and all wonderful things like that. But it's a little known fact that the Likud's party charter, the Likud party platform, the platform on which they were elected, actually calls for Palestine to be wiped off the map. It uses much nicer language, but that's what it calls for. It calls for Israel's borders and sovereignty to expand to engulf all of Eretz Yisrael, meaning the area of the former British mandate. So it's talking about the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So when it talks about expanding Israel to encompass all of that territory, it's talking about wiping Palestine off the map. This is something that you'll not find in the corporate press or the elite media. Just it's a non-fact. So Mr. Ayalon then moves to some obfuscation. So he starts by asking some questions. From whom did Israel capture the West Bank? From the Palestinians? No, in 1967 there was no Arab nation or state by the name of Palestine. Actually, so what this serves to do is shift the focus of the debate, shift the focus of the discourse away from the rights of people and individuals to the rights of states. This is a relatively common occurrence in a lot of Israeli propaganda. States, for example, are a relatively recent European invention, a disastrous one in my view, but that's not important. But for example, we see this in Israel's demand that the Palestinians recognize Israel's right to exist, what they call Israel's right to exist. Again, it sounds innocuous, but no state on earth has a right to exist. It certainly doesn't have an a priori right to exist. There's no such right granted by international law or any other treaties and so on. The only people who believe that Israel has an a priori right to exist are, by definition, Zionists. So the demand, when we talk about Israel's right to exist, what we're actually talking about is the Israeli people's right to self-determination and their right to establish a state. And of course, Israel cannot frame it in the terms of the Israeli people's right to establish a state, because if we do that, it becomes immediately apparent that the right to self-determination and the right to establish a state are the very rights which the Israeli state apparatus is trying to deny the Palestinians. That's why they have to go down the route of focusing on the rights of the state. He then moves on to what we call the defensive war myth. This is something that's it's a common theme throughout much of the propaganda surrounding Israel's armed conflict, none more so than the 1967 war or the Six-Day War. So he says that Israel took over the West Bank from Jordan in an act of self-defense after Jordan joined a war launched by Egypt and Syria to destroy Israel. Now, I'm not going to go over a full description of the events which led up to the 1967 war, but anyone who has a cursory understanding of those events will know that it's impossible to characterize that war as a defense. He starts then by saying it's a common bit of misdirection here. He says the United Nations back in 1967 rejected repeated Arab and Soviet attempts to declare Israel as the aggressor. Now, this is very effective as propaganda because it's entirely accurate. The United Nations as a whole did reject repeated Arab and Soviet attempts to declare Israel as the aggressor. That's entirely accurate. But it's not important what he says, it's important what he doesn't say. So he doesn't tell you that the members of the United Nations were divided into pretty much into three camps. There were those who wanted to declare Israel as the aggressor and condemn them as the aggressor. There were those who wanted to condemn both Israel and the Arab states for sharing responsibility in the conflict, which I think in hindsight is the correct view. And there were those who thought that attributing blame was not constructive. It didn't mean anything. It was an academic fact for historians to debate over. What he doesn't tell you is not one single state wanted to declare the Arab states as the sole aggressor. Not one. Even the United States. In fact, ambassador to the United Nations said the following: Israel alone is to be condemned as an aggressor, though surely in the light of all the events, both recent and long past, that led up to the fighting, it would be neither equitable nor constructive for this organization to issue a one-sided condemnation. That's the US ambassador to the UN. So the picture is very clear. The people didn't want to declare Israel as the sole aggressor. It didn't make political sense, and in my view, that's pretty accurate. But there's no way it can be described as a defensive war. It's simply no way. So we then move on to what we see as the defensible borders myth. He starts by saying Security Council Resolution 242 did not demand a unilateral Israeli withdrawal. Rather, the United Nations called for negotiating a solution which would leave Israel with secure and recognized boundaries, in effect, borders. So this is where they have to stretch the truth a little bit. It didn't talk about defensible borders. That's not a phrase you'll find in the resolution. In fact, although it didn't demand a unilateral Israeli withdrawal, it did emphasize the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. And it called for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. Like I said, I'm not going to go over the full gamut of propaganda surrounding the Security Council Resolution 242. It would take considerable time, but if you read what the chief framer of 242, which was Britain's Lord Caradon, said on it, the intent is very clear. Everyone knew that the Green Line was not a satisfactory border. It's an armistice line. It's an accident of where the troops happened to be on a particular day at a particular time. And he saw this as an opportunity to create secure and recognized boundaries by engaging in minor and mutual land swaps to iron out the border, to make it secure and recognized. Israel has taken this completely, turned it on its head by saying that actually it's completely okay for Israel to acquire territory by war. There's no problem with that. Even a basic understanding of the documentary record shows it as nonsense. He then moves on to what we call the wilderness myth. So he says, if Jordan had no legal claim to the land and a Palestine did not exist, whose territory is it? And again, this is part of the misdirection of changing it from the focus of the people and international law and international humanitarian law to the rights of the states. So the correct question to be asking in these circumstances are, is territorial gain by war acceptable under international law? The very resolution that Mr. Ayalon quoted, quite clearly stresses the inadmissibility of territory acquired by war. It's a non-starter. It's fundamental. It's a fundamental principle of international law. It's also an integral part of the UN Charter. The other question that's important are the Geneva Conventions applicable to the West Bank? These are important questions, and he's careful. The next myth that he moves on to is what we call the Transjordan myth. So he says that Britain's Foreign Minister, Lord Balfour, recognised the Jewish people's historical right to their homeland. A small area, equivalent to about half of 1% of the Middle East, was designated for this purpose. Now, there's a whole books have been written on this subject, so I don't hope to cover much of it, but it's important to understand some of the salient facts. Lord Balfour articulated British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, not a Jewish state in the Middle East. The intent was that the Jewish immigrants would become Palestinians, and everyone would be happy. It's not quite how it panned out. So he goes on to say that at the separation of he shows a video of Transjordan being separated from Palestine, and he says that the Jewish homeland originally included not only the West Bank but also the East Bank of the Jordan River. This is categorically false. I mean, there's very little spin attached here. It's just a flat-out untruth. So in 2016 there was what became known as the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. This was a series of letters exchanged between Hussein bin Ali, who was the Sharif of Mecca, and Sir Henry McMahon, who was the British High Commissioner in Egypt. And this was a negotiated secret treaty detailing British legal obligations towards an independent Arab state. Secret treaties not so common now, but back then they were not uncommon. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, for example, is another instance of a secret treaty. And both sides viewed these as legally binding at the time. Now there is a lot of discussion over some of the some aspects of this correspondence and this treaty. Now there was an area of land allocated as part of this negotiation, which Britain was legally bound to facilitate Arab independence in. And the debate is over whether the area we know as sort of historic Palestine, so the West Bank, Israel, and Gaza, was included in this. And it's fair to say that Britain's position shifted on this over time. It's also important to note that with this being a treaty, this was legally enforceable. It was legally binding upon Britain, unlike the Balfour Declaration, which carried precisely zero legal weight until it was incorporated into the League of Nations mandate. I'm including a link here to a picture, which is a scan of a map produced by the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, in 1915. I'm going to include it on the next slide, but it probably won't come out too well. But so this is a map showing Britain's understanding of the area which was to be given to Arab independence as part of this negotiated treaty. I don't know whether you can see it on the video when it's uploaded, but the area we know as Palestine, the West Bank, Israel, Gaza, is clearly included in that line. Now, when so Britain was legally committed to providing this, and this became very complicated politically and legally when the Balfour Declaration was incorporated into the League of Nations mandate, because now Great Britain had two contradictory and almost mutually exclusive legal obligations. They had a legal obligation to the Arab state that they had already given their backing to, and they also had this latent